Among the many mutants that inhabit the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles universe, few characters are as fascinating, tragic, or misunderstood as Leatherhead. Is he an anti-hero or a villain? A misunderstood outcast or a mutant monster? So how do you remember the classic character of Leatherhead? Well, he was first introduced in the Mirage Comics era of TMNT, and ever since, he's been perceived as a mindless creature who eventually turns out to be quite intelligent. Over the decades, different comics, cartoons, and films have reimagined Leatherhead's origin, personality, and allegiances. Sometimes he's a tortured villain from the Louisiana swamps, and sometimes he's a reluctant ally. However, in most cases, he's tortured, isolated, and often used to make ends meet. Despite these differences, one theme remains constant: Leatherhead's search for acceptance and belonging, which is extremely relatable. So today, we're going to look into each of Leatherhead's origins, right from the Mirage era to the mutant mayhem gender flip of today, and it's going to be a wild ride, so buckle up, friends. We're in it for the long haul.
The original Leatherhead was never really a villain. You know, we often hear sayings like how a monster or a villain is made, not born, but for our mutant alligator, this saying might actually be true to the core. As the story goes, Leatherhead first entered the TMNT universe in Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Volume 1, Number 6, where he was being targeted by Mr. Marlin, an animal trophy hunter. He had recently killed the Madagascan blue elephant, but was bored with just killing ordinary animals, and now he wanted to chase the reports of a giant alligator in the New York sewers. Meanwhile, the Ninja Turtles were in a scuffle when Marlin entered the scene. Immediately, he decides that the turtles are the more valuable prey, but they flee and eventually come across Leatherhead. He tells them about his origin story, how he was once a simple alligator but was accidentally transformed into a mutant by the Utroms. However, far from abandoning him, the Utroms cared for him, even raising him like family. But when the TCRI building fell into destruction, the Utroms were forced to go back to their planet and unwittingly had to abandon Leatherhead. Kinda sad, right? The emotional core of this story is really Leatherhead's loss and his longing to be with the only beings he considers family. Later, with Marlin still in pursuit, Leatherhead destroys a bridge in order to separate the hunter from the turtles. In this issue, Leatherhead is an ally and friend to the turtles, not exactly a villain. But through later issues, like the Illuminated subplot, Leatherhead slowly begins to change. In this story, Raphael encounters an altered version of Leatherhead who's dramatically bigger, with a healed eye, and has some gaps in his memory. Eventually, we discover that he's been used by the Utrom extremists to meet their ends by capitalizing on his desire to return to his family. This revelation transforms Leatherhead from tragic exile into a victim of exploitation by members of the very species he loved. But even then, he doesn't seek vengeance against them. This further adds to his non-villainous persona in this continuity. This tragic character would be revisited in many issues, but they only end up adding to his loyal but grieving facade, someone who simply longs to be with the only ones who ever saw him as someone worthy of care. The tragic human origin of Jess Harley. What if Leatherhead were a human to begin with, though? What if the reason he ended up as a mutant was that he was desperate to survive? In TMNT Adventures, specifically of Turtles and Stones and Mary Bones, the Turtles get involved with a mysterious and eccentric persona named Mary Bones, who, in this continuity, is a big factor in Leatherhead's origin. The issue follows a vastly different plotline for the mutated Leatherhead. He was originally a human before he became a mutated alligator. Originally, he was Jess Harley, a poor Cajun drifter from Louisiana who survived by petty theft. He steals a mystical object, the turnstone, from a very mysterious old woman named Mary Bones, hoping he could make a quick sale of it. But little does he know, this plan would end in a very, very bad way. In a way, Jess Harley embodies personal tragedy in the TMNT universe. Mary Bones eventually catches up with Jess in NYC and uses the very object he stole to turn him into a giant humanoid alligator, Leatherhead. He loses his human instincts and form and is thrown into a whirlwind of a world he doesn't understand. Using this as an opportunity, he's manipulated by the Shredder. Shredder tricks Jess into thinking that the Turtles are responsible for his misery. Naturally, he sets out to take revenge, only to realize who the real trickster is. This issue ends with the supposed death of Leatherhead as he tries to turn the tables on Shredder, but Mary Bones, who's actually a cosmic being, Cherubay, assures that Leatherhead's story is far from over. Later on, in subsequent editions, I think you can clearly understand what the cryptic premonition of Mary Bones means. Leatherhead, of course, survives, somehow, and is in a place known as Stump Asteroid, somehow. There, he participates in wrestling matches with other strange beings, and when the turtles see him again, they urge Leatherhead to return with them, but he decides not to, because for once, he has control of his own life after he lost his human self. Personally, I don't think he had that much control over his life even when he was just a drifter, because back then he was controlled by his desperate will to live and survive. But hey, you go, Leatherhead. Enjoy that autonomy. As the years in the comic pass by, Leatherhead repeatedly aids the turtles and becomes one of their closest allies. He finds a new form of connection when he joins a team consisting of other mutants and outcasts, the mighty Mutanimals. But in TMNT issues 48 through 54, the Mutanimals are involved in a conflict with the Gang of Four. The story steadily becomes darker and darker, and by the end, the team is slaughtered. Leatherhead dies alongside most of the team he considers family. The massacre is one of the most shocking moments in the Archie TMNT comics because it's sudden, brutal, and largely irreversible. The subsequent issues deal with grief and shock, but nothing compares to the tragedy of Jess Harley's life. No matter how hard they tried, as human Jess or mutant Leatherhead, in the end, he was never able to control his life or his death. The fact that he tried to do some good with the time he had secures Leatherhead's place as a truly tragic character. When Leatherhead became a full-blown swamp monster. We've been discussing the sympathetic Leatherhead a lot, haven't we? I mean, our previous two continuities give the character a truly tragic backstory, which was shattered by the 1987 cartoon. This continuity removed just about everything that made the character tragic in the comics. Instead, Leatherhead is the ultimate terror here. Season 3 of the 1987 series, titled Leatherhead, Terror of the Swamp, represents one of the most monstrous villain interpretations of the character in the TMNT universe. Leatherhead is no longer portrayed as a misunderstood outcast or a victim of circumstances as we see in the last two versions, but instead as a dangerous mutant alligator. I think this twist is noteworthy since we have no obligation to sympathize with him because no tragic loneliness is driving his actions. He's not even a friend or ally to the turtles, he's simply a swamp monster with a bad attitude and a taste for intimidation. The episode begins with the turtles reminiscing about their allies, the punk frogs. Meanwhile, somewhere in the Florida swamps, local hunters are looking for the legendary giant alligator, and I think we know where this is going. The mutant creature is huge and downright scary, and perfectly plays the role of the villain in this version. He drives the hunters off, and later in the episode, attacks the punk frogs. He captures them and makes them his servants, much to their dismay. I mean, that's pretty antagonistic, right? One of the frogs, Rasputin, secretly contacts the turtles asking for help. Back in the Technodrome, Kraang detects Leatherhead and is pretty impressed, thinking the mutant alligator could be a trump card in defeating the turtles, so he sends Bebop, Rocksteady, and Shredder to recruit Leatherhead for his plans. Meanwhile, the monster in question is actually clashing with the turtles by trying to trap them in giant nets. The punk frogs manage to free them, and together they capture Leatherhead and tie him up, but unfortunately for our heroes, this is not their climax. As the Ninja Turtles and the punk frogs escort Leatherhead through the swamp, the monster tricks them into stepping into quicksand, but he doesn't realize that if they fall, he'll sink with them too. Nevertheless, Krang's cronies arrive and save Leatherhead, making him an instant ally to their cause. They escape, but eventually, they find themselves in a confrontation with the turtles. Kraang falls into a mysterious spring containing diluted mutagen and is transformed into a baby. The scuffle ends soon enough, but the villains escape, along with our mutant alligator, Leatherhead. This version of Leatherhead doesn't seem to stem from any backstory, except a theory that Leatherhead was mutated by leftover mutagen that had previously contaminated the swamp and created the punk frogs. We're not given any reason to sympathize with Leatherhead here, unlike the comic versions. However, ironically, this version retains the character's most widely recognizable trait, the Cajun accent. This 1987 version pushed him towards the recurring villain category, not a morally complex anti-hero. It's less nuanced to its interpretation. The saddest Leatherhead origin in TMNT history. And just like that, we're back to the sympathetic versions of our mutant alligator, or should we say crocodile this time. The 2003 TMNT version of Leatherhead might just have the most heartbreaking origin to begin with, but it's not just that. This version sits differently, even on a narrative level, by denoting Leatherhead is a crocodile instead of an alligator. My theory is that they made this decision because we saw him in a while instead of seeing him later, but anywho, back to the topic at hand, we think this version paints the saddest picture of Leatherhead because, unlike unlike the other interpretations, it focuses fundamentally on the loneliness of this character. Leatherhead is a tragic figure whose entire life was shaped by abandonment. While it echoes with the origin stories in the comics, it adds its own twist to the mix as well. The story begins with the test of an underwater propulsion device within the sewers. Michelangelo encounters a giant mutant crocodile, which, contrary to his expectations, shows signs of intelligence. Mikey realizes it's not a rampaging monster at all. However, the other turtles have their reservations about Leatherhead, who takes them to his laboratory. Eventually, he tells them about who he is. As a baby, Leatherhead was nothing more than an ordinary crocodile kept as a pet. However, one day, his owner decided he was unwanted and flushed him into the sewer system. For many viewers, this is a minute part of the episode. However, this detail establishes the emotional core of this tragic character. He was utterly abandoned when he was small, but his life changes when the Utroms discover him. After he's exposed to some mutagenic ooze, Leatherhead develops a human-like consciousness. The Utroms then decide to welcome him as one of their own, and Leatherhead begins to see them as his family. However, in a twist of fate, they accidentally leave him behind, and ever since, he's been trying to make a transmat device so that he can reunite with them. The story is sad and gripping, but the turtles learn something that makes it even more miserable. Leatherhead is getting help from Baxter Stockman, who intends to use the mutant croc and his technology for his own purposes. To turn Leatherhead against the turtles, Baxter blatantly lies by insinuating that the reason the Utroms left Earth was because of the Ninja Turtles. Naturally, this spins the rage Leatherhead felt, but soon enough he realizes who is truly using him. In a fit, he tries to attack Baxter, who flees, but makes sure the lair collapses. Despite the chaos, Leatherhead refuses to go with the turtles since he so desperately wants to make sure the transmat device survives so that he might finally reunite with his family. You may be thinking the origin story is exactly like the comics, so why is this one so sad? Well, for us, the real tragedy is that Leatherhead repeatedly finds a home and repeatedly loses it. And finding something important and then losing it over and over, well, that might be the saddest story of all. The Kraang experiment who became Mikey's friend. In 2012, Nickelodeon gave Leatherhead their most cinematic origin. This time, his story has it all. Alien experimentation, a stolen power source, a desperate struggle for survival, and a friendship as its emotional anchor. That's one hell of a plotline, combining the good parts to create a compelling anti-hero background. The plot opens in a secret Kraang facility where a giant mutant alligator escapes captivity and makes a run for it with one of Kraang's devices. As the alligator disappears into the NYC sewers, our good old turtles come face to face with him during one of their patrols. Michelangelo quickly becomes convinced that the alligator isn't a villain, and he's proven somewhat correct when Leatherhead talks about his past. Like every other origin, this one begins with abandonment. He explains that he was once a baby alligator raised by a young boy, but one day he was flushed into the sewers and left to fend for himself. Unfortunately for him, Kraang would later capture him. He took Leatherhead to Dimension X and subjected him to painful experiments which transformed him into a mutant. I think this is where the show switches some stuff up for major cinematic effect. Regardless, over the years, despite his suffering, Leatherhead planned an escape. However, he had no intention of just running, so he stole the Power Cell, the powerful energy source that Kraang uses to portal between Earth and Dimension X in a final bid to outdo his captor and tormentor. Mikey feels a sudden sympathy for the mutant and immediately befriends him. He even gives him the name Leatherhead because of his rough, leathery skin. However, Leonardo, Raphael, and Donatello remain suspicious of the creature. As a reptilian might, Leatherhead struggles to control a violent rage that sometimes overwhelms him. Eventually, Leatherhead reveals why he stole the Power Cell, to prevent Kraang from using it, and he's spent months hiding the device and protecting it from anyone who might return it to Kraang. It's kind of admirable that he's doing this out of pure vengeance for his captor and not just out of greed. This makes him an anti-hero candidate to the core, but Kraang is just a step behind in finding his mutant alligator pet because he desperately wants that Power Cell back. Naturally, he soon tracks Leatherhead to his hideout and launches an assault. A fierce battle erupts in the subway tunnels. While the turtles fight off Kraang's forces, Donatello uses the Power Cell to activate an abandoned subway train. Leatherhead heroically stays behind to hold off the attackers, buying the turtles enough time to escape with the Power Cell. The 2012 version also adds a little twist in the end, the time dilation twist. By the end of the story, Leatherhead stays within Dimension X to fight Kraang and his men, but eventually he returns to his allies, though not unchanged. Due to time moving differently in that dimension, even with a short time lapse, Leatherhead has aged visibly, another way in which this version of the character is unique. So, to be fair, he's once again transformed from the daily monster of the week to a recurring ally who, after years of abandonment and use, has only learned to trust others. Furthermore, the angle of Mikey's friendship adds a certain emotional depth to this version, since at least someone in this harsh world cares for our beloved Gator. It's bittersweet, but it's very appropriate, at least in our books. The darkest Leatherhead the franchise ever created. In the IDW continuity, we get a version of Leatherhead that is unabashedly dark. This time around, we get a highly nuanced version of the character who's out for revenge after years of being wronged. This version is morally complex and not someone who's struggling against circumstances. The IDW version of Leatherhead first appears in issue 49 back in 2015. In fact, you might even call it a cameo because it was short and brief without any definite backstory. He appears for a few panels near the end of the issue where he's shown speaking with Professor Honeycutt and Dr. Harold Lilja. Apparently, Leatherhead possesses mutagen that might help save Donatello after the devastating events of the Technodrome attack. What does this brief appearance do? Well, it simply gives a teaser and establishes that there's a mutant alligator who exists somewhere out there in the IDW universe. Leatherhead's true debut and subsequent origin story come in issues 56 through 58 of TMNT, appropriately titled Leatherhead 1, Leatherhead 2, and of course, Leatherhead 3. In 2016, part 1 of the plot takes us to Burnow Island, where the turtles are summoned. Since the toxic environment makes breathing or surviving there impossible, Dr. Harold provided breathing gear to aid them. There, they meet a giant mutant alligator, making the turtles instantly suspicious. However, despite its appearance, the creature seemed intelligent, and that's how we realized he has more to him than just his appearance. The story eventually delves into his backstory, and this is where the IDW continuity fundamentally differs from every other version. Centuries ago, during the Age of Pirates, he was an ordinary alligator. One day, when the mutagen was mixed with water, he was suddenly changed into a mutant with human-like intelligence and form, but unlike most mutants, he didn't actually join society. He lived in hiding, collecting cans of mutagen and biding his time. This makes him very old and also very volatile. Later on, he even saves Donatello, and at this point, comic readers are inclined to trust him. After all, he seems like a helpful fellow, but is he really? Later on, when Honeycutt tries to revive Utroms using the same mutagen that transformed Leatherhead, he finds that someone has brutally attacked them. By the final panels, it's clear who attacked him and who hurt the Utroms, and obviously, you guessed it, it's Leatherhead. And you might be wondering why this time around Leatherhead is doing a heel turn, especially considering how, in some versions of his story, the Utroms have played Leatherhead's adoptive family. Well, this is where the IDW version fundamentally differs. They make Utroms the manipulative tormentors of Leatherhead. Through flashbacks, it's revealed in part 2 that the mutant alligator and the Utroms had a rocky relationship to begin with. After centuries of living alone, he came into contact with these Utroms who made Leatherhead the prime subject of their experimentation and manipulation. Naturally, this left him physically and emotionally scarred, and while not every Utrom personally harmed him, he hated the whole race equally. To him, they were a big part of his suffering, and his hatred only seemed to grow over the years. As a result, when Honeycutt was trying to revive them, he went ahead and murdered several of them in their chambers, and even attacked Honeycutt himself. Following these murders, the Technodrome was thrown into chaos, and the Turtles immediately started investigating the matter. Their prime suspect was Leatherhead, who, to be frank, was leaving loopholes in his original backstory. Soon, the evidence lines up against Leatherhead, and by the end of Part 2, a confrontation becomes increasingly inevitable. Part 3 follows up on this confrontation and reveals how a sympathetic character from Part 1, who even helped save Donatello, is revealed to be a calculating executioner. The darkest part of this version isn't the murders necessarily. For our money, it's the deliberate nature of the murders. Leatherhead is calm in his conviction and calculating in his revenge. His rage isn't overwhelming him like in previous versions, it's driving him towards vengeance, which he believes he is owed. The first female Leatherhead in TMNT history. Wait, what if Leatherhead was actually a woman? This gender flip is actually kinda refreshing, and in 2023, the Mutant Mayhem version of Leatherhead introduced a cameo to change the trajectory of Leatherhead's origins. We don't mind seeing some change-ups in Leatherhead's backstory since there's no definitive version of it anyways. The film and the subsequent series hardly delve into her pre-mutation life or the experiences that shaped her personality. We just hear Rose Byrne voicing the first first ever female Leatherhead in the TMNT universe, and honestly, it kinda rocks. She exists primarily as a member of Superfly's mutant family, rather than as an individual character with a separate narrative arc. In this story, Leatherhead is part of a gang of mutants created by Baxter Stockman's mutagenic experiments. Mutant Mayhem, fundamentally, is a story about outsiders seeking acceptance. One mutant, Superfly, wants to overthrow humanity in order to create a mutant-dominated world. This radical ideology stems from a lifetime spent being hunted, feared, and rejected. This continuity doesn't explore Leatherhead as a standalone tragedy. Instead, she functions as part of the larger picture. When the movie's story wraps up, she eventually finds a home and a family in the sewers with the Turtles and the other mutants. It's a shame they didn't delve into Leatherhead's backstory more here, because that lore delves into themes of prejudice and belonging and how social rejection can push marginalized groups towards extremism. And honestly, in my opinion, the gender flip really only adds to that theme. But there we have it. That's the end of our list of Leatherhead's origin stories. I think it's pretty clear that Leatherhead's depictions throughout the TMNT universe rely on his contact with the Utroms, mutagen, and subsequent circumstantial events. But one thing is clear, the same mutagen that transforms the Turtles is the one that changed Leatherhead in most versions. So why does he always end up as a monster or a misunderstood anti-hero instead of as one of the protagonists? That's because the circumstances of abandonment and mistrust run high in each of his narratives. This just goes to show that, given the circumstances, a hero can be a villain and vice versa. Anyways, that's all we got for you today, so we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. What do you think about Leatherhead's story? Do you have a favorite version of the character? Let us know in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to see a lot more like it.